Welcome to Unsheltered Conversations, a HomeAid America podcast where housing, humanity, and solutions meet. I'm Scott Larson. Today's episode carries a weight and a mission. On December 21st, the longest night of the year, communities across the country gather to honor and remember the lives of people who have died while experiencing homelessness. This day is called Homeless Persons Memorial Day. Joining me today is Donald Whitehead, Executive Director of the National Coalition for the Homeless, an organization that helped establish this day about 30 years ago. We'll explore the meaning of the day and what remembering actually teaches us, and how for us in the building industry, building safe homes, which what we do, can actually help to save lives. Donald, thank you for joining and being here today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And thank you for this topic. It's really, really an important topic.
So before we get into the details and talking about it, can you give us an overview of the National Coalition for the Homeless? Because some of our listeners may not be aware, or I'm going to assume that they're not aware. Can you give me a broad vision and mission of what your organization does? And even yourself, you've committed your life to this cause. You've worked in direct service, you've worked in advocacy. So tell us a little bit about National Coalition for the Homeless.
So the National Coalition, I'll start with a little bit of history. We are the oldest advocacy group that works directly with people experiencing homelessness. So we started in the late 70s in meetings and incorporated in New York in the early 80s. Our founder was one of the litigators to make a right to shelter a law in New York. And we then moved to D.C. in 1984 and started working on legislation because the issue of homelessness had moved from a local issue to one that was so big that we needed a national response. So we started working with members of Congress. We drafted the McKinney-Vento Act. It was originally called the Homeless Persons. Yes, originally it was called the Homeless Persons Memorial Act, but it got whittled down to what it is still today. After 40 years, it's still a emergency response. It still lacks kind of the major resources to end homelessness. It keeps people afloat. And so after that, we were responsible for drafting and helping to implement the Education for Homeless Children and Youth Act. In between, we've had major organizing efforts like the Housing Now March. We were responsible for bringing over 200,000 people to D.C. Through that, we got the Cranston-Gonzalez Act, and we also did direct action like hunger strikes, and that was, again, how we passed some of the major housing legislation. We worked with the Low Income Housing Coalition on the National Affordable Housing Trust Fund. So basically we do advocacy, we work on education. So we have a couple of direct programs that benefit people experiencing homelessness, a speakers bureau that goes around the country where people tell their individual stories. We think the only way we change narrative is that people get to hear the journey to homelessness through people's own lived experience. We have technical assistance where we work with HUD and SAMHSA and CDC on creating policies and programs to address homelessness. We also do a great deal of grassroots organizing. And finally, we were founded on a civil rights platform. So we work on issues around criminalization and certainly things like the Homeless Memorial Day so that people understand the impacts of homelessness. So that's it.
Yeah. We could probably take any one of those initiatives and spend a lot of time talking about it, but thank you for going into that. And for me, just to know that it started in New York with right to shelter,
Yes.
which is critical. So in talking about Homeless Persons Memorial Day, tell us about how it got started and why December 21st and why that the longest day, the longest night actually is such a meaningful date for remembrance.
So the fact that it's the longest night is why it is December the 21st. So people have to endure elements for the longest period of time. The nighttime is when people are in most danger. It's colder, conditions are harsher. And so symbolically, we use that date to signify, to provide examples of the harsh realities of homelessness. Now, Homeless Memorial Day actually started in Atlanta.
Oh,
And
it
so
did.
there, it did. So there, one of our board members, longtime board members, one of our founders, Anita Beatty, went to her city to ask if anyone was tracking the number of homeless deaths. And there wasn't anybody doing that in the city. And there still isn't many cities that do it today. So she created a list through some of the providers in the city and came up with an enormous number and convinced the Catholic Church in Atlanta to do a memorial service.
Mm.
And we've been doing it ever since then. It got adopted right after that by the National Coalition, and we've been observing it ever since then. And now there's actually three separate observances. We do a in-person observance in DC the day before, and people will sleep out that night in DC at Freedom Plaza. And then there's a march to December 21st where we do the actual in-person. But we also do an online version where we partner with the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council and the National Healthcare for the Homeless Advisory Board.
Well, we'll get into some of those details and even what I was able to look to implement when I was on our counties, our local communities commission on homelessness and establishing Homeless Memorial Day. But in addition to remembrance, what do you see as some of the key objectives tied to policy change or data collection or even community action that's resulting from this day?
So part of the day is to, one, ensure that there is a reality of how many people die alone, unattached to families and friends in our country, and the need to track that data. Because one thing that most people may find disturbing, surprising, is that our medical examiners and our coroners don't track housing status. So
Mm.
while the range of what we think of as people who have lost their lives is really quite enormous. It goes from as low as 5,800 people to as high as over 50,000 people on a yearly basis. And because we don't have the ability to accurately track, we're getting those numbers from local communities because the coroner doesn't do that. The coroner, if a body comes in, there's no follow up to see where that body came from. And we just think that in the richest country in the world, it's really, really unfortunate that the number of people that are dying goes up year over year. And so we want to push, and we have been successful in some places out in California. A few places are now, Los Angeles, for instance, is tracking those numbers. So the
Yep.
goal is to get more communities to track it, but the ultimate goal is to create the resources so it doesn't have to happen. The biggest reason we have continued growing homelessness and growing homeless deaths is we've never been able to get the resources at the level of need. And so we constantly try to make sure that like people completely understand the level of devastation when it comes to mortality.
Yeah, in my local community, we would get the numbers from the coroner, and we would look at kind of that data, and every year the numbers were going up, and at one point kind of exponentially. So when you look at the data, what do you think that tells us about these deaths, and what are some of the underlying causes that might go unnoticed of the deaths on the streets?
I would say the biggest takeaway for me is that the overwhelming majority of the deaths are preventable deaths.
Yes.
So they are chronic diseases that people suffer, but most of these diseases have medical resources that can counteract the lethality of those diseases. So, for instance, people die of diabetes. Now, diabetes kills a lot of people in this country, but the average age of a homeless death is 56. So
Yep.
people, even with that disease, live a lot longer than that. There are respiratory illnesses. There's chronic heart issues that happen. But there's also quite a bit of violence. At one time, we had more people that had been killed as a result of what we consider hate crimes. People did it simply because they're homeless than all the other protected classes together.
Yeah. So you talked about kind of national standardization or the lack of national standardization in tracking this. What do you see as the challenge or the ability to overcome that? Do you see, is it community by community? How do we develop those national standards looking forward?
We have to have people in communities to raise their voices, to demand it, because it is extra work for those medical examiners. And I think, that's by and large one of the biggest reasons why people don't want to do it. But it is really important that we understand, again, the total cost of not addressing homelessness in this country. But the only way that's going to change is if those are elected officials in
Yes.
our communities. And if people aren't doing what we think is the most responsible thing, and I think understanding how many people are dying on the streets of any city in the country is something that should be done, then
Yeah.
we should not vote for those people. We should ask people to be accountable as to what they'll do about mortality for everybody. I mean, because if you're not counting homeless status, you really, are not able to provide a true picture of how people die and where they're dying and some of the underlying causes for any population. But certainly for this population, we need to understand the true cost of the lack of services and supports for individuals.
When we established the stay in my community, we had to wrestle with, is it a pure advocacy day? Is it political? Is it a religious day, a kind of a faith oriented day? And we tried to weave all that. And we brought in interfaith leaders to give messages. We didn't overtly have it to be a voice on a political side, but we did have our elected officials involved and endorsed it. It's a very delicate balance. So what do you see as effective ways that different communities have used this to actually dive into the hidden stories? Because we would just have a list of the names, and part of the service is reading those names and kind of a candlelight procession. But how have communities dived into the actual stories of these individuals and brought those for change to create momentum?
So I think, that juggling act that you described is something that every community does, whether to be, really into the memorialization side of it or the advocacy side. And I think my best practice is to do both. So
Yes.
telling the stories is something we have to do to address the issue as a whole. Homelessness as a whole really is colored by a lot of really negative and non-factual stereotypes. So people have this belief about the population, and the more we tell the true story, the path that people took to get there, and their life as a whole, not this event, because homelessness is an event. It's not a description of people. It is really, really important to raise some of those stories. Now, I just reviewed like the people who've been killed this year as a result of violence, and it's horrific. And people need to understand that our seniors, our families with children, and our young people unaccompanied are losing their lives because we're forcing them into isolation. And that is something that really, whether it be a medical issue or it's an overdose or it's an act of violence, the more we push people into isolation, the more that'll happen. So that's the underlying message that we need to share with our elected officials who are moving more and more towards criminalization, which I think is directly impacting the number of people that are dying homeless in this country. And so we need to really move our legislators. And I think storytelling does that.
Yeah.
And so we need to always have that as an element. But I could give you some other ways people have memorialized people on December 21st. In DC, they carry a coffin, a
Mhm.
march from if you're familiar with DC, from the
Yes.
DuPont Circle area to Freedom Plaza with a coffin. Other communities do a candlelight vigil. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. And some are very creative, some are very somber, some it's a religious music-based event. So a lot of different types of events, a great deal of variety among those events.
Yeah, we found when we were doing it in the way that we did it, we came with the perspective that some of these individuals may not have had any type of service, any type of remembrance, and this was our opportunity to state their name and to have that, we had a printed card and all their names, like you'd go to a normal memorial service for someone that you cared for. And we as a community felt that that was our responsibility to care for that individual because they may not have had anybody in their immediate life at that point in time that would recognize them.
That's something that is a goal for us also. No human being should leave this earth without someone recognizing and remembering them.
Yeah. The other interesting thing with that date being December 21st, it's really the start of a lot of other holiday celebrations, from a variety of different traditions. And since we viewed this from a multi-faith perspective with this, people that came, many people expressed to us that they truly appreciated whatever faith tradition that they came from, that this was the start of their faith tradition, their faith season.
Yes.
And what a better way than this memorial service on December 21st. So HomeAid is part of the building industry, and our focus is on projects that build. It could be a community service center, it could be permanent housing, it could be an emergency shelter. All of our projects really vary. And we're comprised of building industry professionals and developers and different housing networks. How do you see us as an industry meaningfully participating in these types of events and looking at it? Is there any insights that you would want me to make sure that our industry professionals are aware of and that they can do?
Well, certainly, I think there is the need around the country to support these events. There is often a lot of media coverage of these events, and the more people see others in their community supporting, memorializing people experiencing homelessness, I think it actually brings others to the table. Maybe not in the same way, not physically being there, but they understand that these people are not alone and their lives are valuable. So, to the extent that more people from the building community and the construction unions and the other people that are part of your network, the more people can get involved. It sends a message to the media, but also more importantly to the persuadable people in our country who, could be persuaded to support homelessness if they understand that they're not alone in doing that. So sometimes people don't move forward because they don't see their neighbors moving forward, or they
Yeah.
don't see others in the community moving forward. And I think the more people see friends and people that are in their network or their sphere of influence playing a role in these kinds of things, the more it sends a message that it's important. And we have to do that. Sometimes people experiencing homelessness go under the radar screen, and other times they're villainized. People consider them kind of less than or other. And when we connect to these events, we take away the othering of the population.
As we complete projects, and it could be a tiny home, it could be a group transitional type shelter. We often do recognition, and there's residents who will come, sometimes to these events, but a lot of times we'll never meet the people that are living in there. And I truly believe that the built environment is part of the healing process. Obviously, provides safety, security, and shelter. So that's part and parcel of who we are and what we do. And inherently, my view is that helps reduce homeless mortality. There's a group that our HomeAid affiliate in Utah has worked with extensively. That's basically a end of life hospice facility. And it's life changing. I mean, the residents have been on the streets and they come there to die because they're in hospice. But it's a place that is dignified. It's a place that is what any one of us would have our loved ones want to be at, that are in end of life stages. Have you seen other communities embrace that, building dignified places that are needed for people that are in end of life so that they don't die on the streets? Have you seen other communities embrace that, like I was describing in Utah?
I have seen some versions of it. I've also seen kind of respite shelters that will have accommodations for people who are dealing with either minor or severe medical issues and maybe not appropriate for the shelter system. And I do know of a few community-based services that are kind of end-of-life programs. Typically, people are kind of going into the mainstream system for that. So there's not a ton that are set up, but they are set up with kind of respite in mind. And some of those people absolutely don't make it. So a
Yeah.
lot of our federally qualified health centers have support in that way. And I think it's a wonderful idea. Everyone should die with dignity.
Yep.
And certainly it's a lot harder to do if you don't have a place to call home. And certainly most traditional nursing homes are out of reach for our population. It's just way too expensive. And so having those kind of programs is really important. There are a few sprinkled across the country, but not nearly enough.
Yeah, I see when I view the continuum of care and the not necessarily from the HUD perspective, but what's in a community that's caring for issues related to homelessness. This is one of the areas that is often a gap. And I encourage our affiliates to look at it and to say, is there anybody doing this? And if they're not, who could? And could you come in and help them build a facility that does this specifically?
And as you point to that, it will become more of an issue. One thing that happened in last year's AHAR is that we saw a dramatic increase, and the majority of the unsheltered population now 55 and older. So there's a real need for that and other kinds of facilities that are going to meet the needs of our older population. So I think that the numbers will continue to rise, especially if we don't have those kinds of facilities. If you can imagine a senior enduring the conditions that are happening while they're living outside on a regular basis. And especially when we get to the extremes, extreme heat or extreme cold, people's resilience is very low at that point. And so we're going to lose more people as long as we see that growth in that 55 and over population. And the other part of the issue is that for the first time, we're seeing a higher number of new people entering the system. So
Yes.
until we make structural change, that those numbers are going to go up, and the need for the facilities that you described are going to go up. And we're partnering to the best of our ability with some of those groups that are traditionally responsible for working with people 55 and older to try to get some of those kinds of facilities on board and stood up in communities around the country.
Yeah, because the issue of housing is healthcare, and healthcare is housing in many aspects. You know, if someone is on the streets and there's an emergency and they're brought to the hospital, where do they go for recovery, assuming that they are recovering? And so that whole system needs to be intertwined. So this leading into December, and this December 21st day, we're inviting people to, it's inviting people to mourn as well as to act. And what do you think are some of the practical steps that the listeners to this podcast can take right now as they prepare for December 21st?
I think it's a time in our country where we can no longer be silent. We have to really speak out about the injustices that are happening when it comes to people experiencing homelessness in our community. 320 cities have resorted to criminalization, fining, jailing, or arresting people simply because they're homeless. Now, those kind of practices actually increase homelessness in communities. So we really have to push our elected officials to really take the time to provide resources and programs and policies in communities that are going to result in positive outcomes, or we'll see more and more people die. I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of raids that are going on, so people kind of being moved along because they're homeless. What that does is it puts people in isolation.
Yes.
And when people are in isolation, they're victims of opportunity. They can encounter medical issues all alone. We don't endorse encampments at all, but until we have the level of resources in a non-congregate housing setting, we will continue to see people come together so they can be safe in a community. And we can't undermine that until we have the resources to make sure their needs are met.
Yeah. And all those things that you mentioned lead to a state of fear that someone might have. that then leads to anxiety and separation and ultimately accentuating health issues. So on your website, and we'll have a link in our show notes to it, you have an organizing manual, a toolkit that you provide. Can you tell us a little bit of what someone might get out of that toolkit, out of that manual, if they want to organize an event in their community?
Yeah, so there are descriptions of some of the events that are happening around the country, ideas about how to do this, ideas about how to collect names, which it can be very problematic at times. It'll give you kind of the history of Homeless Memorial Day and ways. There's also some advocacy ways that are in that toolkit. Who in the community has access to resources for you to put together a program. It'll also link to other sites with more information, like the Healthcare for the Homeless Council site. So all of those things are included. We're still in the midst of fully developing that this year. We hope to have our 10-point plan and some sample legislation that you might be interested in your team, Scott, about what we think is a really big step in reducing homelessness, and that's the adaptive reuse program
Yes,
that
yes.
takes abandoned buildings and develops them into actual housing. We just did a study with the Pew Trust, and what we found out is that they've created a strategy to move some of the office buildings that have been abandoned into shared living spaces.
Yep.
Uh, a big part of why we have homelessness because we lost hundreds of thousands of those in the 70s and 80s, and this would be restoring that kind of housing option. And it's very suitable for people that are on fixed incomes. And so we really are hoping that people use the toolkit and utilize the plans that we have there, not only for this event, but how to continue to advocate for people experiencing homelessness in the future.
Yeah, and that's great. And I'm glad that you're looking at those, at the different types of housing options, because we are too, and that's right at the core of who we are in communities across the country. So we've covered a lot in this conversation, and dealing with the inevitability of anyone's death is difficult to talk about, let alone the person that's been living on the streets, and trying to elevate that with dignity and respect. But what gives you hope with all of this?
I think, it's hard to find it right now. There's a lot
Yes.
of things that are going in the opposite direction of how we would certainly hope to be in. But I think for me, it's the day-to-day interactions with my staff and with people experiencing homelessness. So there's a lot of when you work directly with the population, there are so many times when you see people's accomplishments that changes their lives. You see people moving on. You see people becoming advocates themselves. Almost daily, I get a dose of energy from one of those stories. So that's what keeps me going. I mean, we are not kind of just a top-down organization that, kind of has their ideas about how to move this issue and change things. We speak directly with people experiencing homelessness. We get our advocacy direction from them and those day-to-day interactions. I do a lot of public speaking, and there's always someone that comes up to me and says, I really appreciate what you said. And I say things like, don't let this situation be your destiny.
Yes.
And you can be whoever you want to be. I always try to tell people that my favorite poem was Harlem by a very famous author that I can't remember right now. But he asked the question, what happens to a dream deferred? And I always tell people dreams that are deferred don't leave or go anywhere. They stick around in special places and
Mm.
wait for the dreamer to arrive. So that is something I try to share with people, but it is really the people that give me optimism. You can't get caught up in the politics or the failures of elected officials if you're going to continue to do this work. And I've been doing it for 30 years. So I've made a goal for myself to have a positive interaction with someone experiencing homelessness every day. And it
Mm.
may be me doing a random act of kindness, or it's me talking to somebody and them sharing, the joy of getting a set of keys and walking into that house.
Into that
I
house.
think we
Yes.
have to focus on why you're here, and that's what helps me get through.
Yeah, and that's beautiful. I have so many things that's striking with me, just in the person to person interaction, and I'm really grateful that even with as many things, policies, and the issues of this day, particularly the days that we're dealing with, that you're able to focus and gain that hope.
Yes.
So I really appreciate your leadership and helping guide through this conversation today and what the coalition is doing for action and remembrance. So for our listeners, if you're part of the building industry with us as HomeAid, think about your next project. Think about the partnerships that you've brought together to build dignified housing, how that can honor the lives that will live there and prevent lives that otherwise might be dying on the streets. Join a memorial event on or around December 21st. And if you're really proactive, download the manual, read the names in your community, talk about those stories, and let's build solutions to this together. So, Donald, thank you again for our time walking through this reflection. And basically, it's a call to action. To our listeners, if you want to focus on this and really dive into it, please reach out. And remember that every home that you build, even in your regular line of business, is so important because it's meaning that somebody is housed. And what you're building is more than just walls. It means that lives are saved. It means that people are remembered and that people are living in places of dignity and respect. So mark your calendars for December 21st. Whether or not you attend a vigil, help compile the names in your city, or just simply reflect. Light a candle in your own home. Take a walk. Take a moment to remember. Let's use this longest night of the year to recommit to shorter nights for those that do not have a place to live. This has been Unsheltered Conversations. I'm Scott Larson. Thank you for listening, and thank you for building hope and homes one at a time.